Okay, good evening. Glad to be here again tonight for the Wednesday night class. It's been quite a while. I surprised myself looking at the calendar, but it's been 8 weeks since I've been able to teach class here in the auditorium, and so we're looking forward to this. Many of you, of course, can't be here. You're watching it at home, thankfully through internet and so forth. But I'm grateful to be able to have this opportunity to be here because, like I said, it's been so long. I'd spent first part of that time, I was in the hospital. I had 3 stents put in to take care of that. I have another one still got to go, and they were going to do that 2 or 3 days later. But then when this coronavirus hit, then all of that was postponed. And so it's been a long time, so I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to be here tonight. And I really hope that what we talk about is going to be something that can help each and every one of us. We're studying here in this class in the book of Exodus, but I know many of you were not in my class, so I want to just kind of review a little bit where we were at. We were studying about the 10 plagues. We've gone through about 7 of them. And so what I want to do is just go back to those and look at those 7 plagues very briefly and talk a little bit about them. The first of these, plague number 1, was the turning of the water to blood, turning the Nile River to blood. Now we have to understand that in choosing this as the first plague that God would bring upon the nation of Egypt, God was bringing it upon that which the Egyptians worshipped as a god. The Nile River was extremely important to their culture, but also to their way of life and to their providing and caring for themselves. The Nile River provided so much for them, not just water to drink, but water to bathe by. It was a place where they had numerous fish that they could use for food, but also the Nile River periodically would overflow its banks and lay down fresh soil across the land that made it much more fertile than it was. And so it was very productive for the people in having all that provided for them. So in plague number 1, God has told Moses to go out to meet Pharaoh early in the morning when Pharaoh would come down to the Nile River. The text doesn't tell us why he came to the Nile River, but it may very well be that he came there for the purpose of bathing. Now we know that a lot of people did that. Back in the first chapter or second chapter of Exodus at verse 5, we learned that Pharaoh's daughter came down to the Nile River to bathe. And so they used that as a place where they came to bathe, but also he may have been down there, some suggested, simply to check the level of the water, to know something about that and how things were going. He may have also come down there, many believe, to offer some type of worship to the Nile, since they worshiped the Nile as a god that served them and provided them so much in life. And so he may have come for that very purpose to do that. And so it's the Nile River that God strikes with the first plague, turning the waters to blood. And in doing that, it no longer becomes a water that they'll be able to drink of. They will not bathe in it. The fish in the river are destroyed, so they will not be able to eat from it. And so God is showing His power over the Nile River as one of the gods that was worshipped by them. And He wanted them to know that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was the God that had power over all of the gods worshipped by the Egyptians. And that's strange about the Egyptians. They had perhaps more gods than any other nation that we've ever known in life. They had gods for everything in the world. And sometimes the same names is used of different gods when they were involved in different things. Sometimes these gods were elevated to positions of great power in their pantheon of gods. And other times they were reduced in that. And so there's a lot of things to be said about it. But plague number 1, to show God's power over the Nile River that they worshipped as a god, when God turned that river into blood. Next, plague number 2, the plague of frogs. Again, frogs were something that were abundant in the Nile River, but the frogs also were something that the Egyptian people worshipped. They had a god of the frogs that they called Hapi, H-A-P-I. And now, all of these, I'm not sure how they pronounced these words, but this was a god that they had. And what Moses did here at God's command was to extend the rod over the river and bring forth the frogs. Now, frogs were plentiful in the land of Egypt, there in the river Nile, but what God does here is something extraordinary. There is an abundance of frogs that are brought forth out of the Nile, and Moses had warned Pharaoh what would happen. That when he brings these frogs up, they're going to be all throughout the land of Egypt. They'll be throughout all of their houses. They'll be in their bedrooms and in their beds. They'll be in their kneading boards. And it was going to be such that the people simply would not be able to stand having the frogs all over the place the way that it was. Now, interestingly enough, in these first two plagues, the magicians of Egypt were able to duplicate these things. They were also able to turn water to blood. They were able to bring up frogs out of the Nile River, not through any miraculous means, but I believe this, as their title said, magicians, was through some trick that they had of doing that. But certainly, while a lot of people think, well, man, that would have just encouraged Pharaoh more, and I often thought that, but I got to thinking about it. Hey, if there's anything that Pharaoh did not want at that time, was for more frogs to be brought up out of the Nile River. He had more than he ever needed or wanted to see when Moses, at God's command, brings up all of those frogs out of the river. Now, one interesting thing about this plague was when Pharaoh was tired of it and he came to Moses pleading that these frogs might be removed, that Moses said to him, you select the time you want them to be moved. And Pharaoh said, tomorrow. And I thought about that. If that'd been me and he'd asked me, when do you want these frogs to be gone? I might have said 3 days ago. I'd want to get rid of those frogs as fast as I could, but for some reason he said tomorrow. Now Richard talked about this in one of his lessons, but there's great lessons to learn from that. I remember one brother that Jerry talked about had developed a sermon that he entitled, One More Night with the Frogs. And in that he talked about some of the things, the problems with that. And really, I think about many ways today, we're no different from Pharaoh was in doing that we're not doing, just what we should be doing. We all have those problems we have in life. We have, many of us have those different habits that we have developed. It may be the language we use, it may be in smoking or drinking or anything of that nature that a person might have, and we know it's wrong, we want to get rid of it. But so many, many times, our thought is, we're going to do that tomorrow. We'll start working on getting rid of these problems tomorrow. William Barclay said one time that the worst day in the life of any human being is the day that he learns the word tomorrow. Because when he learns that word, everything that he ought to be doing right now are the things he's going to do tomorrow. And that's the way it was with Pharaoh. He wanted to get rid of those frogs tomorrow. Plague number 3 that he talks about were gnats. Some translations has the word lice there, and there's several different things that could be used in regard to this. The word that's used there in the Hebrew language can be used of a number of different types of insects. Sometimes it's not just gnats or lice. Some believe it's talking about mosquitoes or maybe even talking about sand fleas. But whichever it is, all of these things are insects that would be very irritating to us. It would make life unpleasant. They're not going to be threatening our life, or we're not going to put ourselves in danger in that regard. But it's the type of things that just make life miserable. If you've ever experienced any of these things, and many of us have, I can remember trying to play ball outside, playing baseball, and I always liked playing second base, but it seemed to me that in the summer that all the gnats seemed to swarm around second base. And you couldn't open your mouth without getting a mouthful of gnats or breathing them in through your nose or your mouth or into your eyes. And it was extremely irritating and hateful. And I sometimes would joke about that to people. I tell them, these things are the very things that would lead a person to believe that there's no God. Because these things are not needful. They don't do anything except cause problems. But listen, these things serve God. And God is able to use these things, even the tiniest of things, the gnats or the lice or the mosquitoes or the sand fleas, whatever they are. God is able to use them to accomplish His will. And He uses them here in this case to teach Pharaoh a lesson, to try to persuade Pharaoh that he needs to give up his rebellion against God, and he needs to obey God in letting his people Israel go free. That's what needs to be done. And then we come to plague number 4, a plague of flies. Again, flies are a common pest just about all over the world, and they were there in the land of Egypt. And we're familiar with flies and the problems could be, but the swarms of flies here were swarms in their house and on the ground. They couldn't walk without stepping on them. And in their house, they were all over the place. Now, in this instance, in those other plagues that had been brought, the first 2 plagues, for instance, the magicians were able to duplicate those things. But they're not able to duplicate these other things. And when the gnats came, they were the ones saying to Pharaoh, this is the work of God, of a deity of some sort. But in regard to the flies here, they become to recognize this is more than just the work of another God. But they recognize that this is the work of the God of Israel, of Yahweh. And I know that because during this plague that God makes a differentiation between the land of Egypt and the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived. The flies were throughout the land of Egypt, and all the people were tormented by those. But in the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived, there were no flies. There was no plague there. And so the people were spared from that. But again, God is showing His power over the Egyptian god of the flies. I'm not sure how you pronounce the name. Uachin, U-A-C-H-I-T, was the fly god of Egypt. And yet God showed His power over that god. He commanded these flies to come, and He could also command them to depart. Plague number 5, the plague of murrain on the cattle. That's the way it's given in the King James Version. Others read either pestilence or plague, but it's something that affected all of the cattle, the livestock of the people there. And that word cattle is used of a number of different types of livestock, just like it's more than just over the cattle, the cows and the bulls and so forth, but also over horses and over donkeys, and every type of livestock they might have are affected by this. And this is something that brings death to those animals. And so here we begin to really see how that the Egyptians are going to be hurt financially because of this plague. So many of the animals they have are going to die. And yet, Moses had made it clear that this plague would be upon the Egyptians, but not upon the Israelites. None of their cattle would die. And when this plague came, Pharaoh sent people over into the land of Goshen to check and see, and they came back to report to him. None of the animals of the Israelites had died. All of them were spared. And so he knows this is the working of the true God, the God of Israel, not the God like any of those gods that the Egyptians worship. Then plague number 6, the plague of boils and sores. This plague was brought by God when He commanded Moses to take some of the ashes from the kiln, to take those ashes and to throw them up into the air in the sight of Pharaoh so he would know what's happening. And those ashes became dust that spread throughout the land of Egypt. And upon all men and beasts brought forth these boils and sores upon the people. And again, this was something that was so severe that even the magicians could not stand before it. And so these magicians, who had initially been able to duplicate some of the things that Moses would do, were not able to duplicate any of these, but they find that they themselves are crippled by this particular plague. So severe the magicians could not stand before Moses. And so God tells Pharaoh that He, Yahweh, could have killed Pharaoh and his people at any time with these plagues. But God is doing it by these plagues over and over to impress upon them the power of God, and also that God's power and His might may be known throughout all the nations. And you know, later that happens. The people in those nations, when Israel comes out of Egyptian bondage and they come in to take that land God promised them, the people there are already aware of the Israelites and of their God. They've heard what God did for them in the land of Egypt in destroying the firstborn. They knew about what He had done and given them victory over Og and Bashan and their conquering of the land there. And so they knew about that. And so what God had desired to accomplish here had been accomplished by that. Then plague number 7, the plague of hail. This is something that God has used so many times in life to punish those. To punish, in this instance, those who are His enemies, but also He used them sometimes to punish His own people. The book of Joel gives us a time and example when God brought the plague of hail upon His people and used that as a means of punishing them because of their rebellion against God. But there are other times too that God used hail against those of His enemies, the enemies of His people. In the book of Joshua, we read about that in chapter 10 in verse 11. When the Amorites have come into battle against Joshua and the Israelites, and the Amorites have such a huge army against them, but the Bible says that God cast down stones against them. And later in verse 11 and verse 12, it mentions the fact that it was hailstones that God hurled down upon them. And the text says that God killed more of the Amorites with the hailstones than Israel killed with their army. So God used hail many times as punishment for those who would not live for God the way they should. And so here, God brings a hail that destroys both livestock and people. Now earlier, livestock had been destroyed by the plague that God brought upon those animals. But that was only upon the animals that were in the field. There were other animals kept up in the barns and so forth where they were protected from that. But now these cattle, these livestock, plus the others, are also going to be afflicted by the hail that comes, that many will be destroyed. Now there were those among the servants of Pharaoh who had heard the warnings that Moses had given them over and over again, and they heard Moses' warning this time about this plague, about what's going to happen. And so they took care to see to it that their cattle that they were responsible for were put into the barns where they're protected, and they themselves went into those barns that they might be protected from it. But the hail destroyed animals and people, but also destroyed the crops that were growing at that particular time in all the fields. And so God is bringing more and more destruction upon the plagues. Are getting worse and worse, that Pharaoh might be brought to a sense of God, of His power, and would be willing then to listen to God and to free His people. The last two plagues we haven't studied about in class yet, but we're going to study about the plague of locusts. Then plague number 9 will be the plague that's given there of the darkness that comes. But I put on this little chart, and I hope you'll be able to see this, but those first column of plagues that are mentioned there, plagues 1, 3, and 7, these were all announced ahead of time by Moses to Pharaoh while Pharaoh had come out to the Nile River. The next plagues, plagues 2, 5, and 8, were announced by Moses to Pharaoh at Pharaoh's palace. Because each time the text says that God told Moses, go in to Pharaoh. So he had to go into his palace to produce that. Then the last 3 plagues we talked about here in this far column were all brought without warning. On these others, God had told Moses what to say to Pharaoh and to warn him about what's going to happen to them. But with these 3 plagues, they all come without warning. So as we look at these plagues, these 2 plagues, as we begin here again to fully talk about these things, the plague of locusts found for us in chapter 10, verses 12 through 15. And we want to look at what the text says about this plague. And so reading here, I'm reading from the New King James Version. It says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt, for the locusts, that they may come upon the land of Egypt and eat every herb of the land, all that the hail has left. So Moses stretched out his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind on the land all that day and all that night. When it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts, and the locusts went up over all the land of Egypt, and rested on all the territory of Egypt. They were very severe. Previously there had been no such locusts as they, nor shall there be such after them. For they covered the face of the whole earth, so that the land was darkened. And they ate every herb of the land and all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. So there remained nothing green on the trees or on the plants of the field throughout all the land of Egypt. And so here we read about what God did in bringing this plague of locusts upon them. Again, locusts are a plague that God has used other times in life. In the book of Joel, you'll read about the locusts that God brings upon Judah because of their disobedience, not listening to God to do His will. And here God brings these locusts upon the Egyptian people to persuade them of God's power and the fact that they need to listen to God and do what God has told them to do. But as we think about these verses, before we get to the actual locusts themselves and what all's done, look at some of these pictures here to give some idea of the power of these locusts. These mostly are made there in Africa, where even today, really starting sometime toward the end of December, and I know going through February, there was these huge locust plagues there in the land of Africa. But they do not come anywhere near to the plague that God has brought upon the Egyptians. God had said they had not seen anything like that before in Egypt, and they wouldn't see anything like that again afterwards. But look at the plagues and some of the ideas that you have from it, the pictures of it. This is one that was made more recently, I think made sometime in January, maybe down in Ethiopia. But here's a man out there in his fields trying to drive these locusts away, but there's no way he can do that. And the United Nations has talked about this and about the great problems that's going to cause to the people down there because of all of their food being destroyed by these locust plagues. You look at an example here. It's a picture of a tree made prior to the locusts coming in, and then sometime after you look at it and see that everything is stripped bare off of that tree. They have that ability to do that, such huge amounts of food that they're able to eat and destroy these crops. Here, you can hardly make off in the distance, but you can see there are locusts coming up out of the field fleeing, but the corn crop there has been completely destroyed by that plague of locusts. And so when you think about this and all that's been done by that, the plagues that God has brought upon the people of Egypt, what that must have been like. But there are other things here about this I want to notice. Number one, in talking about this, there have been people who question their belief in God and in God's Word. And they're always looking for mistakes to be found in the Word of God. The skeptics are always looking at that. And so some of them have done this. They've raised the question here, did Moses obey God in bringing about this plague? They believe they found a contradiction in the text there of what's said about that. I want to move back to the text just to see this. But when he talks about it here in this text, did Moses stretch out his hand or did he stretch out the rod? God said stretch out your hand, and yet the text tells us that Moses stretched out his rod. Now, can you believe it? There are people that look at that and say, well, here's a contradiction because Moses is not doing what God told him to do. Isn't that foolish how people can look and reason about things sometimes in that regard? But God had shown Moses the power that he was to find in using that rod. The rod became the symbol of that power, and it was used to bring about these plagues over and over again. And so when he stretched forth his hand, as the text says that Moses did, you understand that rod is in his hand. So in extending his hand, of course, he's also extending the rod. He's doing exactly what God said. But people who hate God and hate the Bible and don't believe in that will do anything they can to try to find some kind of mistake in that. A second thing they point out, did the locusts cover the face of the whole world? You know, the text is made, and look at that in verse 15 of this. It says, for they covered the face of the whole earth. But then there are people say, now, did that really happen? Did the locusts really cover the face of the entire earth? Well, the answer to that is no. Well, was Moses wrong in writing this? Absolutely not. The use of a hyperbole, we do that sometimes when we want to emphasize the importance of something or when we emphasize the severity of something, that we will exaggerate tremendously about that. And that this is just used in that sense is clear because he makes it plain later on here and what he's talking about. He continues on in verse 15, says, for they covered the face of the whole earth so that the land was darkened. And they ate every herb of the land and all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. So there remained nothing green on the trees or on the plants or the fields throughout all the land of Egypt. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about the land of Egypt. The locusts have destroyed all of that. They've come upon them to destroy that. But in doing that, he uses the hyperbole to say it was the whole earth, to emphasize to the people how much destruction is brought about by God because they refuse to obey God. Plus also the fact that it makes it clear here again that this plague was not brought upon the land of Goshen where the Israelites were. And so Moses understood that. It wasn't covering the whole earth. It's just covering the land of Egypt that's done there. But now, the thing about this, to see something about how destructive this is, maybe just want to get this in maybe, then we'll have to close out our lesson for this evening. But we look about it and some of the things it said about the desert locust, which many people believe it's brought forth here. But the desert locust is found in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. They inhabit some 60 countries and can cover 1/5 of Earth's land surface. Desert locust plagues may threaten the economic livelihood of 1/10 of the world's humans. A desert locust swarm can be as large as 460 square miles in size and pack between 40 and 80 million locusts into less than half a square mile. Each locust can eat its own weight in plants each day. So a swarm of this size could eat 423 million pounds of plants every day. So think about the destruction that this would bring upon the Egyptian people. And that's why Pharaoh referred to it as a death itself that God's bringing upon them, and the destruction of all this by the locusts. Well, there's more to say about that, and hopefully next week we'll begin at this point to talk more about that, and then look at the next plague, the plague of darkness, and then after that the final plague, the death of the firstborn. God bless you. We're grateful to be able to be back again to share with you in this lesson, and hope to be back again, Lord willing, next Wednesday. God bless you.